welcome to yet another Wednesday webinar. Our topic for today has to do with reading comprehension. So our speaker for today is our resident, verbal expert Anuja Sundar. She knows everything there is to know about the GRE.
Thanks for that introduction, Sana. What we're going to do today is we're not going to take an RC passage and try to crack some questions. Instead, we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to try to understand the types of GRE passages you would encounter. And when I say types, I mean the way these passages are structured. Arriving at an idea of the structure of passages and understanding what they're trying to tell you in a broad overall sense is a huge key to cracking the meaning of those passages. I'm going to show you exactly how helpful that is. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, the GRE Verbals reading comprehension, I'm just going to give a really brief introduction for those of you who have just now started your prep and don't have a very clear idea. In the GRE, we have two sections, right? Ideally, that is the quant and the verbal. And apart from that, you also have something called the analytical writing. Today, we're going to focus on one aspect of the verbal sections, that is the reading comprehension questions. And these are really big, they're really important because they comprise 50% of the questions in any single verbal section. That is right, 50% of your entire verbal score is going to be based on your reading comprehension performance. And in a verbal section, to get an idea of how many reading comprehension questions you can expect to encounter, you would probably see within one section, 2 short passages with about 2 to 3 questions each, and along with that, 1 long passage with about 3 to 4 questions. Okay, and remember, you're going to see at least 2 full verbal sections in your GRE. You may even see 3. Okay, so you need to prepare yourself for anywhere between 4 to 6 short passages and 2 to 3 long passages. And these are the number of questions those typically have. And now what we're going to focus on today is not so much the questions and the question types, but rather the passages and what they consist of. So why do you need to understand passage types in the GRE? How's that going to help you? Well, understanding passage types can help you in a lot of ways. One of them is that it is going to provide you with a very clear sense of what you're looking for in a passage, right? So once you have an idea, the first couple of lines will give you a hint and kind of a peek into what the passage holds. You'll have a better idea of what to expect and what that type of passage typically consists of. And that also helps you tackle the questions. Right, so once you have this clarity, you will also understand the organization of the passage, the way it's been structured in order to present the information to you in a sensible, logical way. So you'll also understand that. And of course, finally, once you've got a grasp of what the passage has and how it's organized, how it's structured to deliver that information, you would be able to solve those questions a lot quicker because you know exactly where to look for the answers. Right? You have a very thorough understanding of not just the passage, but exactly its mechanics. And that's what we're going to arrive at today, right? That's what we're going to see. So what kinds of things do an RC passage contain? What are we looking at here? And I'm going to have a lot of terminology coming up, and I'm sure it's going to look a little scary, but don't worry about that, okay? As I explain all of them to you, they're going to become very simple and clear, and you're going to see some examples as well. All right, so any RC passage is a logical flow of information, okay? By nature, any piece of writing typically has some logical flow of information. Somebody's trying to present some detail to you in a cogent fashion. So all of the sentences are going to be linked to one another, and one point will flow to the next in a natural way. So in that sense, it is very logically structured. And the GRE RC passages, it goes without saying, they're of a very high standard. Remember, this is the kind of material that you are expected to be able to read and understand for your graduate studies programs that you are applying for. So it is going to be of a very high academic standard, and it is going to have a logical flow of information, which means there's something very clear in there, and it's got a very clear purpose, what it's trying to say, and why it's trying to say those things, how it says those things. All of these things are very clear in that passage. They're all contained in there. Now, apart from the logical flow and a very clear purpose about what it wants to tell you, An RC passage also contains all of these categories of information. When I say categories, I mean this isn't the info itself, but rather the type of information that it's going to try to convey to you. And of those, we have background information or a premise, right? Something that gives you a basic idea of the topic at hand would be the background information. It just primes you there. Okay, you probably don't know anything about marine biology. I'm going to give you a couple of sentences to get acquainted with that. That's what your background information is. Apart from that, you may have an argument or a claim. An argument would usually try to support one particular side of something. A claim would try to put forth an idea and kind of push that and say, here are all the supporting points. Apart from that, you also have contradicting views, right? Sometimes for an argument, you may also present views A, B, and C, all of which contend with one another. How do they support which side of the argument? All of those are also seen in passages. You'll also have evidence. So if there's a claim given, there may be evidence supporting that claim to make it a much stronger claim. And you also have concluding statements. Note that not all passages have concluding statements. It may be presented in other ways. It may not necessarily look like a conclusion, but it would come to some sense of a conclusion. So passages contain these kinds of information. We're going to get a better idea of those in just a second. So these are the elements of an RC passage that you need to keep an eye peeled for. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, there's background information. It is something that is meant to familiarize you to the topic at hand. They're not just going to go deep into marine biology without giving you any sense of an introduction. You will have some background information. A claim is something that is like the central idea being discussed in the passage. Right? The passage isn't going to talk about marine biology as a whole or introduce the study to you in a very generic way. It's going to have a very specific claim being made about something particular within marine biology. That claim is going to be what's discussed in the passage. Sometimes you have what is called a problem statement. It is an idea or a thesis that is being contended inside the passage, right? You would have a question being raised. Okay, why does this happen? What is up with this phenomena? And that may be what people argue about. And those arguments are what are presented in the passage. You may also have additional views, contending views on that idea or a person. It could be about a person. So the passage may begin by mentioning a person of a particular time period and say these were their achievements, these were what they did, but people felt A, B, and C things about them. And these are the different views that we get. In addition, you also have something called a cause. A cause is anything that's a reason behind any phenomenon or an event. So if we're talking about some kind of like gamma rays or something, a cause may be the thing that causes, the thing that is the reason behind that particular phenomenon. You also have an effect, of course, something that is the result or the output of an event. So of course, don't assume that just because there's a cause in a passage, you may have an effect. These may appear in different ways. We'll see examples to show you what I mean. And of course, there's something called a mechanism. Of course, you don't have to worry about the terminology, but this just refers to a description of a phenomenon or an event. So not only do you get a cause, like X happened because of this, or an effect, due to X, something happened, you may also have the mechanism of X. You may get an idea of how X takes place, how it happens, and all of the stages or steps involved. That would be the mechanism. And finally, this is something that's very important that makes a lot of GRE RC questions very tricky. It's the author's view. And this term refers to the author's opinion on something in the passage. And please note that in the case of GRE RC passages, the author's view is never something that's very emphatic. It's never very strong. Okay, so they're never going to 100%, say, support something or deny something, reject something. It's usually something relatively nuanced. They may support, but they may not be like extremely happy, or at the same time, they might not feel completely dejected, right? So you're looking at a very nuanced opinion in these highly academic texts. And that is what the author's view comprises of. We'll see some examples to get a better idea of how these function in an RC passage. Now that we know the elements of the passage, I'm going to tell you about the two broad categories of RC passages. And we're going to look at one RC passage of each type to see how those elements function in those categories, how those elements help make meaning in those passages. The two categories are: one, exposition. This type of passage provides a comprehensive description of any idea or theory. Okay, so the whole point of the passage is to describe something, right? It is not trying to advance an argument, but rather just explain something or how it happened. The other type, you may have guessed, is argumentation. That is right, something that presents two or more sides of an argument or a contention. It may or may not have a resolution. Just because there's an argument, don't expect there to be an answer at the end saying, hey, side A wins or side B wins. It may just be an argument that cogently presents these two different sides and leaves something, maybe gives the author's opinion at the end and leaves the rest for the reader to think about. So these are the two broad categories of RC passages you're going to look at, right? We have expositions, something that describes an idea or theory, and argumentation, something that argues, that presents the two sides of an argument, and you may or may not have a resolution over there. Okay? Now we're going to look at one of each type and try to identify those elements that we looked at earlier in those and see how it makes it a lot easier for us to understand the passage as a whole. Okay. Now an exposition type of passage. Of course, now I'm telling you in advance that it's an exposition type. You're not going to have that advantage when you tackle these passages yourselves, but you can see by reading the passage how you can identify whether it's exposition or argumentative in nature. It's going to be relatively obvious once you get a hang of it. Now let's go ahead and look at what exposition types passages always contain. Now the order may differ in an exposition passage, like in one passage you may see these in this order, in another you may see it in another order. But all of these passages will contain these elements. That is, they will have background information because after all they are describing a phenomenon or an event. They will also have some kind of a claim, an idea being discussed in the passage. They will have any of these, a cause, an effect, or a mechanism. Mechanism describing the phenomenon, an effect of the phenomenon, a cause for that phenomenon, any of these could be discussed. Remember, again, it's an exposition. It is introducing something. It is explaining and describing something. So all of these elements could be seen, one or more. Remember, you don't need to have a cause and an effect in a passage. You may just have one or two. You may even have all three. And finally, you will also have the author's view in this type of passage. So at the end of everything, the author may present what they think about this particular phenomenon. So that is what an exposition passage will contain. Let's go ahead and take a look at a passage and get a better idea. Right, I'm going to read it. This is a relatively short RC passage, GRE RC passage. Let's go ahead and read it and see how we can identify the elements of this exposition passage. Reviving the practice of using elements of popular music in classical composition, an approach that had been in hibernation in the United States and during the 1960s, composer Philip Glass, born 1937, embraced the ethos of popular music in his compositions. Glass based two symphonies on music by rock musicians David Bowie and Brian Eno, but the symphony's sound is distinctively his. Popular elements do not appear out of place in Glass's classical music, which from its early days has shared certain harmonies and rhythms with rock music. Yet this use of popular elements has not made Glass a composer of popular music. His music is not a version of popular music packaged to attract classical listeners. It is high art for listeners steeped in rock rather than the classics. Okay, I know that may seem like a lot to take in, but let's go ahead and break it up. I'm going to just break it into smaller chunks with some portions highlighted. Let's take it one sentence at a time. All right, so we have the introductory sentence over here where the first chunk tells us that somebody revived a certain practice. What was that practice? It's the practice of using elements of popular music in classical composition. So we already know this passage is going to be something to do with music. In this case, we have two distinctions, right? We have classical music and we have popular music. According to this first chunk, we see that some popular elements are being used in a classical composition. So a classical composition is expected not to really have elements of popular music, but over here, somebody is reviving the practice of doing that. Of course, there's always the nuance. Note the word revive. It means this practice has always been around, but whoever's doing it is reviving it, which means it was not so much in popularity for a while. And that is what the second chunk tells us, right? An approach that had been in hibernation in the United States during the 1960s. Okay, so this approach, what approach does that refer to? That is right, using elements of popular music in classical composition. It had been in hibernation in the United States during the 1960s. Hibernation, as you may know, refers to a long period. It's usually, it's a phenomenon that is observed in animals, right? They go into sleep for a long time. And during that time, they're not at all functional. Their body functions go down to the very minimal, right? Nothing is active. So that's what hibernation refers to. So this use of popular music, elements of popular music in classical composition was in hibernation for some time until composer Philip Glass comes along and revives this practice. What else do we know? He embraced the ethos of popular music in his compositions. So we have the composer, Glass, coming around, reviving this particular approach, and he likes using elements of popular music in his compositions. So what type of composer do you think Glass is? Now, when I ask you a question like this, you may wonder, hey, why don't we just move on to the next sentence? But no, I'm going to tell you it's very important for you to pause and really think about what you've just read, okay? This is the next level of reading comprehension. Not just passively moving from sentence to sentence, but actively thinking about what you're reading and asking yourself questions about that. So what do we know about Philip Glass as a composer? What is the context of the sentence? It's talking about using elements of popular music in classical composition. That means Glass is one of those classical composers trying to employ these elements. So Glass, we know so far, is probably a classical composer, all right? Now we have this opening sentence that's telling us that Glass did this, all right? Let's see what it's followed up with, all right? We have a sentence about Glass basing two of his symphonies on music by two musicians, David Bowie and Brian Eno. And we also get a note saying that the symphony sound is distinctively his, right? So even though he based those symphonies on music by other people, the sound was something that was his own, right? It's not like he just imitated what they did. When you heard it, you would be like, yeah, that's Philip Glass. You wouldn't think of Bowie or Eno. You would think it's Glass, right? It's distinctively his. He really owned it. But what is the context of this sentence in the passage? Well, we just read that he liked to bring in elements of popular music in classical composition. We know that he's a classical composer. But look at that. He's based two of his symphonies on music by rock musicians. So one inference we could probably make is that rock music is something that is typically considered popular rather than classical. If you're not 100% sure, you can go ahead to the next sentence and get that confirmed, because the next sentence, if you remember, said that popular elements do not appear out of place in Glass's classical music, which from its early days has shared certain harmonies and rhythms with rock music. So here we have a concrete tying together of the word popular and rock music, right? So because Glass has, from his very early days, had music very closely resembling rock music, kind of having these rhythms and harmonies similar to rock music, now we don't feel popular elements are out of place. We don't feel they don't belong in Glass's classical music, even though these two are not typically associated. Because Glass has been doing this for a long time, we don't think it's something out of place, right? It's something relatively natural. We're really used to it. Again, context of the sentence of the larger picture, what is the connection with the previous sentence? We saw that Glass based his symphonies on music by rock musicians. Now we know he's been doing that for a long time. It's got a lot of harmonies and rhythms linked to rock music. And popular elements are therefore not surprising in Glass's classical music. Finally, the last chunk told us that yet this use of popular elements has not made Glass a composer of popular music. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, it's trying to establish that even though he used all of these popular elements, he doesn't suddenly become a composer of popular music. As opposed to what? That's right, we saw earlier that he is a classical composer. So even though he's used all these popular elements, he doesn't just suddenly become a composer of popular music. he is still a classical composer. Why? Let's see what the author has said. His music is not a version of popular music packaged to attract classical listeners. It is high art for listeners steeped in rock rather than the classics. Okay, so we see that his music is not about trying to make popular music appealing to classical listeners, right? At the end of the day, he's still a classical composer. He's not a popular composer. But he's also got these popular elements because those who are steeped in rock can go to a higher art form through his music. That is what they can gain from this text, right? So now we've understood what the passage is talking about. Now, if you saw, I've broken this up into smaller chunks. What are these chunks doing? What are the functions of these sentences? How is this an exposition passage? You can see that there's no real argument as such here. They're not different views being presented. The whole passage is trying to push only one claim. The claim that Glass is somebody who embraced popular music in his classical compositions. So that is what that first chunk was all about, right? It was pushing that claim. It was just telling us that this is something I'd like to say about Glass. I'm going to describe this to you, and this is the claim that I'm making about Glass. He's somebody who would embrace the ethos of popular music. What is that followed up with? It's followed up with a mechanism, right? The next sentence was something that told us how Glass incorporated popular music in his classical compositions, right? That is the way that is done, right? It's like the way an event or a phenomenon takes place. It's the mechanism, how Glass did this. And that is then followed up by the effect. So because he would incorporate these things in his music, we know now that popular elements are don't feel out of place in his music. He's been doing it a long time. The effect of that is that it's not out of place. It doesn't feel like it doesn't belong. Whereas a random classical composer trying to bring in all of these cool, popular things may not do such a great job. But Glass, he's been doing it for a long time, and this is the effect. Finally, if you pay close attention, we are getting the author's view at the very end, right? The author is trying to establish. Now, so far, he's talked about how Glass did what he did and what the effect of that was. Finally, the author here is trying to establish that Glass doesn't become a different type of composer. The author's opinion is that Glass is still a classical composer. And the author is advancing that this is high art for listeners of this kind, right? This is the author's opinion. It's not like a general statement. It's not like the sun rises in the east, right? It is an opinion. And that is how this exposition passage concludes, right? Tells us something about Glass, advances a claim, tells us how that works and what its effect was, and finally what the author's opinion on that claim is. Now, having understood all of these nuances of the passage, tackling the questions is going to be a lot easier for you because now you're able to differentiate the author's view from the claim. You're able to understand how Glass did what he did and what the effect of what he did was. So you've basically got every little nuance of this passage there is to be understood. No matter what question somebody asks, you are going to be 100% sure. And that is the advantage of knowing the structure and the organization of a passage, the type of passage you're reading. Now, we've taken a look at this type of passage, right? We saw exposition. What is an argumentative type of passage? Well, argumentative passages usually have the following elements, okay? The primary purpose is to argue something. So you can expect a problem statement, okay? Some issue being pulled up, some question, right? And once that issue is pulled up, after that you may get a little bit of background information on that issue, right? Okay, before we just dive into the debate, you may get some background information. After that, you will be presented with a few views, okay? One view supporting one side, another view supporting another side. Those are going to be naturally presented in an argumentative passage. You can expect that. Finally, you may also get the author's view or a resolution to the problem. The author's view may pick either one of the sides. It may even pick something a little more nuanced. A resolution may also opt for one of those sides. We don't know. But at the end, you're going to have one of these two being presented. So an argumentation, you can see, is clearly different from exposition. In exposition, all it does is it takes the effort to describe something. There's no argument. There's no debate. Over here, there's a clear debate with multiple views. Okay? Let's take a look at a passage to get a better idea. Here it's very obvious, right? Right when you read the first sentence, you know. Was Felix Mendelssohn a great composer? Yeah, I'm sure all of you are like, yes, problem statement, right? We have a question being raised. Was Mendelssohn a great composer? What do you think this passage is going to be about? Yeah, it's probably going to be about answering this question, right? Let's keep reading. On its face, the question seems absurd. One of the most gifted prodigies in the history of music, he produced his first masterpiece at 16. From then on, he was recognized as an artist of preternatural abilities, not only as a composer, but also as a pianist and conductor. But Mendelssohn's enduring popularity has often been at odds, sometimes quite sharply, with his critical standing. Despite general acknowledgement of his genius, there has been a noticeable reluctance to rank him with, say, Schumann or Brahms. As Hagen put it, Mendelssohn, as a composer, was a minor master working on a small scale of emotion and texture. All right, so I'm not sure if you felt that, but the tone in this passage was way different from what we read in the previous one, right? Now let's take a closer look by breaking it down. Let's just take it one bit at a time. So we have this opening sentence, which was a huge clue for all of us. It's a clear problem statement. Was Mendelssohn a great composer? We know this passage is going to try to answer this question, right? What came after that? Well, we saw the next couple of statements try to establish what we know about Mendelssohn, right? We think the question is absurd. That seems to be established. And then after that, we're told something about Mendelssohn, that he is one of the most gifted prodigies in the history of music. That's really building it up, right? He produced his first masterpiece at the age of 16, which is really young, right? So we're getting a lot of background information. You can see that structure. What about the next sentence? From then on, he was recognized as an artist of preternatural abilities, not only as a composer, but as a pianist and a conductor. Okay, so after composing that first masterpiece, he was just acknowledged. Everybody saw that he was an amazing artist. He had all of these amazing abilities. He wasn't just a great composer, but he was also a great pianist and a great conductor. So that's a lot of talent, right? So more background information. We're getting to know about his talents. What next? Okay, so far, before we read the rest, so far, what kind of answer are we getting for the problem statement, right? We're getting one view. We're getting a view that he was probably a really great composer, right? Everything so far seems to support the answer that he was a great composer. What next? But Mendelssohn's enduring popularity has often been at odds, sometimes quite sharply, with his critical standing, right? Now we see a contrast, right? We see the passage changing its direction. Now we understand that Mendelssohn, although he was really popular, enduring popularity means he was popular and for a really long time. That popularity never died. This popularity has been at odds, right? It's kind of hit heads with something else. What? His critical standing. What do we mean by critical standing? That means his reputation amongst critics, right? So even though he was really popular, which means the masses, lots of people loved him, that popularity did not agree with how critics felt about him, how critics thought of him, right? And there was a stark difference. It says it was quite sharp, right? There was a stark difference between these two. What else do we learn? Despite general acknowledgement of his genius, there has been a noticeable reluctance to rank him with, say, Schumann or Brahms. Okay, so the passage says there is a general acknowledgement of his genius. Everybody seems to say, hey, yeah, he was a great composer. Yeah, he was quite a genius. Despite this, even though this happened, there was a reluctance to rank him with two other guys. Okay, we have a Schumann and a Brahms. It is perfectly all right if you don't know any of these names. If you don't know who Mendelssohn is or who Schumann is or who Brahms is, don't feel frightened. You can still understand the gist of the passage, right? You never even have to know who Mendelssohn is. Just from the first two sentences, we've learned a lot. That is what I meant by background information. They will provide you enough to understand the context. And from this sentence here that we just read, a noticeable reluctance to rank him with Schumann or Brahms, what do you think about Schumann or Brahms? Are they better composers than Mendelssohn? How do critics feel about them? Actually, you can understand from the sentence, just from the sentence structure alone, you can learn a lot. So Note that there's this contrast word, despite. So despite acknowledging his genius, they didn't rank him with Schumann or Brahms. So his genius was not enough for him to be ranked with Schumann or Brahms, which means probably that Schumann or Brahms were ranked at a much higher place, right, by the critics, right? So despite his popularity, his critics were not so happy with him. They didn't like to rank him with Schumann or Brahms, right? So now we have this second opinion, right? So the first half we saw was all first view about Mendelssohn, and then now we're getting a second view about Mendelssohn. What about the final sentence of this passage? As Hagen put it, Mendelssohn, as a composer, was a minor master working on a small scale of emotion and texture. Okay, don't get frightened if you see quotations like this. It's very common across a lot of GRE passages. They usually use these kinds of citations to support some opinion or the other. It is your duty as a reader to identify which opinion is being supported. So over here, Hagen has said something about Mendelssohn. Is this a positive thing or a negative thing? Well, from words like minor and small scale, we can understand that Hagen didn't really have a good opinion of Mendelssohn, right? He thought he wasn't such a great guy. He was working on a small scale. He was a minor master. He was a master, but a minor one, nothing exceptional. Okay, so as Hagen put it, Mendelssohn was something not so great. Now, what do you think as Hagen put it means? The key here is that we actually have the author's opinion being snuck in right there, right? It's not just saying Hagen said. It says as Hagen put it. So when you say, as my friend mentioned earlier, you're agreeing with what the friend says, right? The same way, when the author here says, as Hagen put it, the author's actually agreeing with what Hagen said. That is where we're getting an author's opinion over here. You can see that that was the concluding statement over here. It didn't really end a debate in a clear sense. It provided what the author felt was their opinion on Mendelssohn. And they tried to support their opinion with Hagen's critical input. Okay, so we can see the structure of this was of the following type. We saw a problem statement. We saw some background info. We got one view on Mendelssohn. We got another view on Mendelssohn. Finally, we got the author's opinion, which was supported by this quote of Hagen's. All right, and that is the structure of the passage that we just saw. We could see how the argument was advanced, how it was supported by different views, and what note it concluded on. Now you've got all of the nuances of this passage in your mind very clearly. You're very certain about what the author felt as opposed to what the general opinion was, right? Remember, the question was followed by, the question seems absurd, right? Because he was a gifted prodigy, which means a lot of people still felt that he was really great. But there were all of these critics who felt otherwise. And we also know the author felt otherwise. Okay? So I hope this gives you a clearer idea on what these two types of passages are and how it can help you arrive at what the passage is trying to say, what it really wants to convey, and how it's done that conveying. Now, before I close for today, I also want to provide a small strategy for long passages because I know we didn't look at any of those today. Both of the passages were relatively short ones, but nothing for you to fear. Long passages are very similar in structure to the short ones, right? They have all of the same elements. Typically, they just have more details. So if you get a view, you may get a little bit more explanation on that view or something supporting that view or something like that. It just builds out a little bit more, but it's actually essentially the same structure. The skeleton is the same. So just go back to these two structures and try to apply them and see what you're reading and see if you can understand better what the passage is trying to say. Now, that being said, it's very important to understand the function of a part of a passage. That is what helps you catch these elements. Think about what it's doing there. What is it trying to establish? Is it supporting the view you just read about? Is it providing the author's opinion? Is it giving you background information? Asking yourself those questions will give you a much better idea of what you're reading. And once you've done that, what you should do is, every time you've read the passage as you're reading, try to summarize the parts of the passage that serve a particular function. Say, hey, this part gives me the background information. This part gives me views 1 and 2. Doing that will give you a little passage with which you can face the questions, right? It'll tell you exactly where to look when you need something later. Okay, that is a really helpful key because then you don't have to sift through the entire passage all over again. One good reading of the passage is more than enough to tackle those questions if you do it right. You don't have to be reading it again and again and again, right? And the most important thing I hope you carry away from this is that these passages, as you can see, have clear logical structures. They either describe something or they argue something, which means there's always a story in there. There's always something interesting for you to read about, something new for you to learn. So please approach these passages with a very open mind. You're going to pick up something very interesting. If you didn't already know about Philip Glass before, he's actually a very famous composer of film music. So if you're a movie buff, especially those movies in the 1950s or so, you should really go back and see Philip Glass is behind a lot of that. If you want to learn more about Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn is actually one of the most famous composers of all time. But these are all little tidbits of information you get about them that can really enrich your understanding of these fields, these areas, things that you won't read about in everyday parlance. You won't come across these things. But someday, somewhere, it may help you make an interesting conversation. So approach it with an open mind, and you will find that you learn a lot through these passages. All right. Now, I know that it may seem tedious or difficult to do these summaries and so on, or to keep asking yourself all these questions, but I promise you those are the steps you need to take to become a better reader. And as I said, all of these passages are going to be the kinds of content you're going to see as graduate students in your dream university a few years from now. Okay, so I cannot stress enough the importance of being able to handle this content, being able to tackle RC in the verbal section. Okay, so please practice these things. Practice it in writing initially, write it out, okay? And eventually, once you've had enough practice, you'll start doing it in your head. You won't need any cues, you won't need to write everything down. It comes naturally to you. And at that point, you've become a very good reader. That's something that's going to help you for your entire life, not just for one exam. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And you can always check out our other webinars on RCs, on question types, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to just have Sana take over.
Thank you so much for that extremely informational webinar, Anuja. That's it for now. Until next Wednesday, this is Sana and Anuja signing off.